I'm Karen Burkhardt. I am the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, Assessing the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy and Operations. So I want to take just a moment. I want to thank all of those organizations that support us. Thank you to the Richard Petritz Foundation and to our institutional members, the Alpamar Foundation, the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak State College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, Cedar Chartered High School, and Fountain Valley School. Thank you to each of these organizations. Tia, don't go anywhere. We are so excited to welcome a new staff member to our team. Tia Miller, right there with me. You might have known her. She will be working on events and programs, and so help me to make her welcome if you haven't already. Before we get started, I want to invite our board member, Peter Gerfein, to say a few words about our exciting new travel opportunity.
Thank you, Karen. As Karen said, I'm Peter Gerfein, member of the board, and Karen told me about the Vietnam and Cambodia trip that's coming up. There's a flyer on all of your tables, and I was very excited because my wife and I just got back from Vietnam and Cambodia. And I would be very surprised if a lot of people here have already been there, have not already been there. I want to briefly tell you that we visited 4 of the sites that will be on the tour this coming March. Hanoi, of course, where we got to see the main square with Ho Chi Minh's burial site, but more importantly, the best coffee in the world. If you're a coffee drinker, Vietnam, go for it. We then landed in Da Nang and went down to Hoi An, which is a United Nations World Heritage Site. Crabs, we had a terrific time there, and we ate very well. The food everywhere, amazing. From there we went to Saigon. Now it's Ho Chi Minh City, but if you talk to anyone in Ho Chi Minh City, they'll say it's Saigon. And we did a food tour in the rain on Vespas in Saigon. And when we finished, our guide said, "You are now officially Saigonese." We then went to Cambodia, to Siem Reap, where Angkor Wat is, the largest religious structure in the world, started in 1150 AD. A terrific opportunity to see and understand the culture of Cambodia. And Carol Zandmiller, our board chairman, when I started talking about the trip to Southeast Asia, asked me the most peculiar question I could imagine, which was, what's the oddest food you ate? Now, we ate street food everywhere, in Saigon, in Hoi An, in Hanoi, and in Siem Reap. And the street food in Cambodia was based on the food that the Cambodians were eating during the Khmer Rouge massacre. I mean, the country was decimated by the Khmer Rouge, and they were desperate for protein, for food, and they went into the fields, and they ate locusts and crickets and silkworms. And they're still doing that. That's part of their diet. But perhaps the oddest thing I ate was whole fried baby frogs. Crunchy and delicious. So take a look at the brochure. If you go to our website and click on travel, you'll get more information about it, including the travel agent who's putting this together, who's an expert on Southeast Asia. So I hope you sign up and enjoy.
So tonight, we have the distinct pleasure of hosting my friend and colleague, Bill Clifford. Bill served nearly 10 years as President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, where he led WACA's national office and represented its nonpartisan, nonprofit network of more than 90 World Affairs Councils across the United States. Currently, Bill is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a member of both the Korea Economic Institute's Advisory Council and America 250's International Partners Advisory Council. Bill's background includes time as a Tokyo-based journalist covering international economics, finance, and politics. After working in Japan for a weekly newspaper, he moved into broadcast news as a senior correspondent for CNBC Asia TV. In 1999, he joined the pioneering multimedia venture CBS MarketWatch as its founding Asia bureau chief and directed online radio and TV news coverage in Japan and Hong Kong. He holds an MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS, BA summa cum laude in International Relations and French Literature from Tufts, and a CEP from Sciences Po in Paris. Help me to welcome Bill Clifford.
Am I on?
Not yet.
Not yet? Pressing the button. Test, test, test. Let's see. Tia. I can use my broadcast voice. I think I'm on now. Yes. Hopefully that'll be the only technical sludge. Karen, thank you for that very warm introduction. It just tells people how old I am in some way. And Tia, welcome to the council, the sponsors, the members, and all of you who are here. I can't tell you how much I love having badges like the World Affairs Council here in Colorado Springs. It's great to be back because I spoke about 4 years ago, and I had my penultimate board meeting in this hotel around the corner in the summer of 2022, ahead of my final national conference, which this week kind of feels like, because there's been a presidential debate. I enjoyed a nice inward-looking chat last night at Elaine and Jack Rush's house for a few folks, where we delved into media, election, the US election, and how to stay sane amidst it all. We didn't have that much to talk about, did we? Well, it is a most consequential election campaign indeed, and with more than a few twists and turns, like the surprises of the first debate, the assassination attempt, horrific, the decision by Joe Biden to drop out of the race, Kamala's rise, 2 groundbreaking conventions in some ways, and of course this week's debate. The stakes are high all around. There's lots of uncertainty, and especially in the realm of foreign policy. That's certainly true for the vast Indo-Pacific region, arguably the world's most important. And Asia matters crucially for America, but we didn't hear that much about it in the public discussions by the candidates. It hadn't come up much in the debates. And this includes the complex challenge that a rising China poses to the US and the world, probably the most significant strategic issue for the 21st century. Some of the coverage in the mainstream press has been pretty good, as has the analyses in more specialized media. And let's consider the most recent presidential debate, though. Mere minutes were devoted to just a couple of clipped answers. One on Russia's 2.5-year illegal invasion of Ukraine, on which Trump was pushed more than once and has some explaining to do still. And Israel's war in Gaza, where Vice President Harris has much more explaining to do also. Both of these issues have important implications for the war in Ukraine, for the Indo-Pacific and world order. And yet China was barely mentioned at all. It came up obliquely in terms of, tidbits about semiconductors and tariffs, and that was it. So a whole host of issues confronting Asia and the US in this region were overlooked. That leaves it for us to take up these issues and discuss them tonight. And that includes the biggest one of all, which is the future of American regional and global leadership, which has enabled so much stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. That's in question because Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have starkly different views, different worldviews. So for this discussion, first I'm going to quickly run down some of those key issues and lay them out, hopefully for questions. Then they won't be overlooked. Then I'll turn to elections, plural. Next, a deeper dive into the power and order of the Indo-Pacific and the challenges and risks to that order that stem from principally China and North Korea. I'll discuss China's ambitions under Xi Jinping and how the Trump and Biden administrations have approached Beijing amid a climate of a rare climate, but still not entirely complete bipartisan consensus on China policy. And finally, we'll look at US-China relations and how they're likely to be handled by the next US president in the context of Indo-Pacific strategy. So first then, some vital issues. We have, and by the way, each of these would be great for the Council to discuss one by one in their upcoming programs. Beijing's aggressive actions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Taiwan, labeled a couple of years ago on The Economist magazine's cover as the most dangerous place in the world. US relations with treaty allies and partners, such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad. North Korea's nuclear threat and its renewed partnership with Russia. And last but far from least, or far from only, democratic backsliding in India, Indonesia, Pacific Islands, elsewhere in the region, plus China's meddling in the local politics of so many countries, including Australia and New Zealand. All these issues affect peace and security for the entire region, and the Indo-Pacific is vital to US political, economic, and security interests because it's home to the world's biggest economies, the biggest and most advanced militaries. Let's put some more numbers to this. 6 of 25 of the largest economies in the world are in the region. 14 of 25 of the world's biggest militaries are there, including several nuclear powers. It's home to half the world's population. 19 of the top 100 global universities, by some trackers, locate this in the region, and 10 of 25 of the top countries filing patents are in the Asia Pacific, so it's highly innovative. Its strategic importance has been reflected in Obama's pivot or rebalance to Asia, in Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and in Biden's extension of both. There have been successes and failures, or opportunities and missed opportunities, and we'll get into that. The benefits, though, of a relatively stable environment, free of great power wars, and the phenomenal rise of what has become a core engine of global economic growth, 70% of global GDP. The benefits are huge. And US administrations have evolved the post-war strategy, post-World War II strategy, containment and prevention of hegemons, not only there, but also in Europe and the Middle East. These 3 regions are quite distinct, and yet they present similar dilemmas for US policymakers. Europe is characterized by neoliberal institutionalism, which we see in the EU, which we see in their democratic values, institutions like the World Trade Organization, as well as NATO on the security front. Middle East, characterized by strong men, weak states, non-state actors, all competing with great ambition, especially regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then the Indo-Pacific is more like a classic power politics scenario among states, kind of like Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. The goal for the US, generally throughout the post-World War II period, has been to lead and sustain the liberal international world order. Do we know what we mean by liberal here? It's not our political spectrum liberal. Okay? Anybody want to throw it out? What do we mean by a liberal order?
Multinational.
Multinational, rules-based, norms, values, rule of law, idea that you will solve problems diplomatically without resorting to conflict, and when there are conflicts, there are procedures and covenants and things governing human rights, intervention, that sort of thing. The United Nations as well, for that matter. So we have pursued that broad thrust, and also regionally, but the dilemmas, I would say, are twofold. Shoulder the vast majority of the cost for defense of our allies in order to preserve that border, with the risks of free-riding tendencies, or reduce US capabilities and engagement in these regions, but in the Indo-Pacific we're talking about, and that risks undermining mutual commitments, treaty commitments, other commitments, and reliability in the eyes of our partners. The second dilemma is what we're trying more and more to do these days. How do we build up the allies and partners' own capabilities? And the risk here is if we do that rather capriciously or without really careful assessment of regional geopolitics or individual country dynamics, then we risk fueling lingering historical resentments, competition, and potentially prompt and incite regional instability. So those two things we got to keep an eye on. And then let's look at the perspective of the states in the region. There are two big variables staring at them. One, anybody? Exactly, China. A much more powerful and much more assertive China. And the second one?
China, US,
Bingo. The uncertainty about US reliability and credibility. Will we stay engaged? This is crucial to all of our allies. There are 5 treaty allies: Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, and Thailand, who's figuring less these days, but New Zealand was, but left in the mid-80s because they didn't want US nuclear subs patrolling their waters, so they withdrew from the so-called ANZUS treaties. But these allies are concerned, principally, though, I would say, South Korea and Taiwan, also Japan. Actually, all 3 of these countries have benefited so much from the order, as have undemocratic countries and non-allies. The 2 players that I want to emphasize, though, are South Korea and Taiwan, because for so many years, they were run by dictatorships, and they bought into the order even then. And through their creative and resilient leadership and good diplomacy overall by the United States, they rose to become thriving, prosperous democracies. And so they are not only in themselves key components of American allied power, they also stand for something. They stand for what's possible, and they project our values to other countries who can aspire to the same thing. As I said before, this is also against a dynamic region that's in flux. What a year for voters 2024 has been. More than 40 key elections across the world this year. In January, the Council on Foreign Relations listed 10 key elections to watch. The first 5 were in Asia: Bangladesh, Taiwan, Pakistan, Indonesia, and India, plus, of course, the United States coming up. And last month, Japan, surprisingly, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida decided to leave power, and that means there will be a Liberal Democratic Party election, which will likely pick the next Prime Minister of Japan. That's happening, I think, September 27th. So these contests, 3 of the 4 are in the Quad. Australia didn't have an election. And in addition to that, South Korea had very important legislative elections that have impacts in the region, particularly as concerns Japan, North Korea, and China, as well as us. Why do these matter? Bangladesh and Pakistan for South Asian stability, transnational issues like climate, extremist violence, and in the case of Bangladesh, we could also say refugees from Myanmar. The leader, Sheikh Hasina, has been ruling for 15 years. She's a tyrant. She looks like a lovely, peaceful grandmother, but she's ruthless. And she was just ousted. She won election, and she was ousted last month by a mass protest where there was a lot of violence and many killed. But ultimately, the military stepped in, asked her to leave. She is now in exile in India. And Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate, who is an elder statesman, is now, and he was under the threat of conviction and arrest, he's now the interim leader, and the future's uncertain. Taiwan, of course, the potential for conflict in China that could reverberate globally. We'll get into that later. Indonesia and India, by sheer size, because of the regional and global relations they had amid the US-China competition, and also because of their problems of democracy, these are important. And as I said, they're the 2 variables of rising China and US credibility in its engagement. So let's dive a little bit into China now. There have been I'm going to skirt through centuries of history. There have been essentially 3 prior orders that concern China. One is the Middle Kingdom, where they ruled supreme. That lasted until the Qing dynasty collapsed at the end of the 19th century. Their foreign relations were kind of just an extension of their domestic relations. And really, until Western powers and Japan started to dig in, they didn't give too much thought to it. They were just at the top of a hierarchy, and they allowed some autonomy, and there was an understood respect, and they thought they were the best. Then was the short period of Japan's ascendance and attempt to develop a so-called greater prosperity sphere. This began in the late 1900s. They defeated China in a war in 1895. They defeated Russia. They were in the conferences at Versailles, and the militarists and the domestic political situation led to an aggressive Japan that ultimately was thoroughly defeated by the US, bringing an end to the rising sun supremacy. And then it was us, okay? Beijing, since liberalizing in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping, has grown so rapidly, to use a Donald Trump phrase, the likes of which the world has never seen. And US objectives, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, were essentially in a form of engagement and to bring them into the system. And again, because we had dictatorships like South Korea and Taiwan, which is a renegade province according to Beijing, right next door, the hope was that with economic engagement, ultimately political liberties would follow. They didn't. Still, under the leadership of Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and others, they tended to respect the order, play well within it, look for opportunities to get their people in positions of power in multinational organizations. So the order was generally respected, but under Xi Jinping, this has changed. They are now a power that is not only wealthy, technocratic, confident, authoritarian, Leninist, but they are highly ambitious. When the 19th Party Congress happened in 2019, Xi Jinping became the paramount leader, the chief decision maker across everything, politics, the economy, the military, the party, especially the party. He stated, and this is a very easy way of conceptualizing China, under Mao, China stood up. Under Deng, China grew rich. And under Xi, China became strong. His goal over the next several years to 2035 is to create a socialist modern country, a modern socialist country. From 2035 to 2049, halfway through this century, which will be the 100th anniversary of the People's, the Communist Party of China, they want to be a great modern socialist country. And what that really means is having their international order the way they like it. Okay? A few days after he became paramount leader, he gave a speech, and this was published 2 years later in 2019, declaring, "A new form of Marxist theory is overturning traditional theories of the West. It is inevitable that the superiority of our socialist system will be increasingly apparent. Inevitably, our road will widen. Inevitably, our country's road of development will have increasingly greater influence on the world." So, this is not Kamala Harris's socialism or Marxism, by the way. And I would argue later that she has nothing to do with those philosophies. The source and conduit of all power is the party. And this is the problem with the United States. They are the driver and purpose of all political activity at home and abroad. The foreign relations of China are driven by its domestic concerns almost entirely. They listed 11. 10 of them were domestic. All right. But in the context of crafting a new world order, we have to pay attention. And when they collaborate with the United States on issues like climate, which is great, understand that they're not doing it altruistically, either are we, by the way, in many cases, but we are more than they are. I will defend that. But they are doing it because the party, when it faces activists on issues like climate or anything, there are severe ones from natural disasters to pollution and so forth, its political power, its legitimacy is threatened. So they will use the international arena to deliver policy that they can present to the people and secure the legitimacy. China, in this century, looked at the US as increasingly weak, even though we looked at them at the same time early on as, in Robert Zoellick's words, a responsible stakeholder. 9/11 and the war on terror and its aftermath, especially, made us look weak in their eyes, distracted, spending lots of money that we could have spent on domestic infrastructure and so forth. The great financial crisis, even worse, because this was our system that spread a global problem and damaged growth and the financial markets worldwide and caused, symbolic doubt about our ability to run affairs globally. And as Lenin said, because we are talking about a Leninist power, probe with bayonets And if you encounter blush, proceed. If you don't, withdraw. And that's pretty much been what the wolf warriors of Xi's diplomatic corps have been up to. Now this, this approach has prompted differences among US administrations. Biden and Secretary Clinton articulated a pivot to Asia, which in theory was not a bad idea given China's rise. But they came up way short of fulfilling that vision, partly because of Afghanistan and our distractions elsewhere, partly because of sporadic diplomatic engagement, partly because, yeah, I think the biggest fault was the inability of the Democratic Party to secure the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that would have bound our allies and partners in an economic framework. And of course, Donald Trump decided day one to withdraw from that. So that was the stalled pivot. Trump presented something entirely unorthodox to the preceding 65, 70 years of how America conducted its foreign policy in the region and more broadly. To his credit, and not enough credit was happening as this policy was being implemented because of other things he was doing, but also things he was saying, and also it was unorthodox. So I'm talking about the stark imposition of tariffs on steel, aluminum, and others. But why I think he made a mistake there was he also imposed those tariffs heavily on our allies, Canada, Japan, Korea, the EU. And his public statements then about alliances, questioning the worth again and again of NATO, sent signals to Asia. His questioning of very publicly, what's the worth of our bases and our personnel in South Korea? They should pay 5 times as much. Ditto Japan. This rings so many alarm bells in those Asian capitals and to everybody around watching. So it was, in typical fashion, brash and disruptive. But I think he gets credit for appraising Xi and the challenge, if not the threat, that China represents. Also troubling, though, was his fondness for dictators like Kim Jong-un, Putin, Orban, and the rest. So not just because these are people who are enemies historically and currently and have values antithetical to ours, and their greatest hope is that we collapse the order and withdraw, but the personalized leadership that Trump favors with Xi and Kim and Duterte and Mohammed bin Salman and others, it's clubby, it's private. It encourages influencers and it takes away mechanisms of our civil service, our foreign service, that are quite important. The other thing that happened was there were so many ambassadorial posts that went unfilled during the administration that the proper conduct of diplomacy everywhere was troubled. And again, going to the personality side, impulsiveness complicates geopolitics. So mixed marks for Donald Trump. Biden has largely extended those tariffs, which comes as a bit of a surprise, but he is also heavily invested in successful legislation that has a strong industrial policy streak with the goal of bringing jobs back home, which he claims Trump talked about but didn't deliver on. Biden has, to some extent. But this policy is troubling for its unorthodoxy with respect to neoliberal free trade theory that is, obtained for so many decades. And we see just very recently, if you've been watching the case of Nippon Steel's intended acquisition of U.S. Steel in Pennsylvania, which makes a lot of sense given that Nippon Steel has invested a lot already in the U.S. because the investments like it and other Japanese companies have made have provided jobs, and we've grown accustomed since our trade wars of the late 80s and early 90s with Japan to welcome their investment. This is probably our most important partner in Asia, and we're slapping Kishida in the face or in the rear end as he walks out the door next month. It's not nice, Joe. And so, again, mixed results on these policies, and we can get into that more. But on the alliances and partnerships front, I think Biden has done a remarkable job to restore as best he can the actual working alliances in Europe and in Asia, to rally lots of countries in coalition to prosecute the war in Ukraine without sending troops, and generally inspiring a sense of comfort because Lloyd Austin, Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, Jake Sullivan, which, by the way, worked together as an incredible team and have been there for the entire 4 years, have gone to Asia multiple times in both bilateral and multilateral forums, as well as the ones that come to the US, like APEC in San Francisco, and most importantly, I think, was last summer's first ever tripartite summit at Camp David with Kishida and Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea. To have bridged the animosities that have separated South Korea and Japan and made dealing with problems like North Korea and others so difficult is a massive achievement. And so credit for diplomacy and restoring alliances. Now, we have an election. Oh no! What does it mean? Continuity? Change? I think mostly continuity, actually, given that Trump and Biden have, on the economic front, or now on the military front, are it's pretty solid. But we don't know who's going to win. Right? It's a dead heat, and there are, as I said, stark worldviews. I think where the difference is going to come is again going to be, what do we think about the border? How much do we want to lead? And how much do we want to invest in this region, in all regions, in alliances and partnerships, in empowering our allies and partners? How much do we want to invest? And foreign leaders have an influence on our agenda. After George W. Bush got elected, 9/11 happened, and his whole campaign foreign policy for us was out the window, and we had a war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. Whatever the next president says they want to do, Asia's full of surprises and could change things on a dime. I think personnel it's often said personnel is policy. Philip Gordon, who worked in the Obama administration, before that I think the Clinton administration, also is Kamala Harris's chief advisor on foreign policy, and he is a respected, pragmatic centrist whose expertise has specifically been in Europe and the Middle East. He can do the work, but we've pivoted, and so it will be interesting to see if Harris would retain some of the policymakers and thinkers from the Biden administration. Trump looks like he will rely on Robert O'Brien, his last of several national security advisors, who has a recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, and Robert Lighthizer, who was his USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, and the thrust behind the tariffs and export controls. And Lighthizer could very well be our next Treasury Secretary. He has editorialized about devaluing the dollar and has persuaded Trump, it seems, as Trump's articulating, 100% tariffs on China and many tariffs in all directions. Lighthizer has no qualms about even going back to, he was a critic of Reagan, he was a critic of China's accession to the WTO, so he's Trump's guy. There are two other individuals we know about from the Trump years. Elbridge Colby, who has a book, Strategy of Denial, a couple of years ago, and Matt Pottinger, who is in the National Security Council. I believe Matt, who I knew as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal in China, I think he quit after January 6th. So if he did, he's not coming back. So Trump sees no fairness on trade, intellectual property. He sees military threats, and his policy is America first. I don't think there's a lot of unpredictability there, except what he's going to say out loud at that moment. But he's America first, and that scares people around the world. Kamala Harris, I think, probably will be a little less, let's promote democracy. She's shifted in the campaign from Biden's democracy versus autocracy approach to more freedom. And we're not going to go back. I'm just going to not turn the page on Asia. We're not going to go back, but we're not going to turn the page. But I think she will be a stronger voice on human rights, judging by what she said about Gaza. Staunch support of Israel, but also critical of the violations in Gaza. And if you articulate that, you ought to articulate it elsewhere. We know that there are contradictions and hypocrisies, so we'll have to watch for that. So that's the choice, and that's the mystery, and that's the policy thrust. We can get into the dangers and your concerns, and I just want to thank you very much for listening to my talk. Everybody must vote for whoever.
I'm going to be coming around guys and passing the mic for questions and commentary, so just a heads up with that.
Thank you for your lecture. Quick question. Most of your lecture focused on Northeast Asia. I'm going to go down to Southeast Asia for you.
Okay.
Let's talk about China, South China Sea.
What would you like to know?
Talk about the Spratlys.
Okay.
Talk about the threats
Philippines.
to Taiwan. Yeah, Philippines as well as Malaysia.
Sure.
Please.
By the way, I believe 60 Minutes is going to air a program on, I was watching ads in the hotel, promo videos rather, our policy in the South China Sea, and I think reporters are on our ships. So you see the deployment of Chinese vessels around, and so they have built up, as you know, islands of reefs and rocks, and they're using this to establish power, to potentially project power, and to contest the disagreements that they have in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea. In the East, it's primarily with Japan. In the South, there are a whole host of countries because I regret now that I didn't bring a map to share with you. The 9-dash line. So to China's southeast, off Fujian province, is Taiwan. Tiny little narrow Taiwanese strait separates them. And further to the east are a collection of islands before we get to the Philippine archipelago. And so that's where you have the Second Thomas Shoal and other shoals. And the 9-dash line refers to a kind of U that runs north to south and back north, in between the Philippines and Taiwan, and it's a little like halfway through I'm envisioning, dips halfway down the Taiwanese island. And by the way, their claims to these waters as being China's have been overruled in the international court. The U.S. doesn't respect them. Nobody's respecting them. They are asserting themselves aggressively, and in a way that dictators often do. They say it, they repeat it, and they keep doing it, and sometimes it gets taken in. But under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines has stood up. His predecessor Duterte had shifted a bit to China. The pendulum's back, and the U.S. has, I believe Austin and Blinken both were in Manila not long ago, and this is a treaty ally. And the renewal of commitments, I believe, the U.S. is promising 4 more ships for the Philippines, and is likely to be present in a way with the Navy and other military to show China to back off. So it's a hot spot that could get very hot, and Taiwan is a separate story altogether. There are regular sorties by the Chinese Air Force. There are probes constantly in Taiwanese politics by cyber and so forth. And in the election that was in January, and the new leader, William Lee Ching-te, he's from the Democratic People's Party, the DPP, which is the party that used to advocate for independence from China. So there was heavy cyber disinformation going on. He won, which is an unprecedented 3rd term for his party, replacing Tsai Ing-wen, who China cut off relations with because of her stance on her attitude toward the consensus on what Taiwan actually is. William Lee is toning it down a little more, and plus he lost his parliamentary majority, which she had twice. So he could be suffering some gridlock. The Kuomintang Party, the Conservatives, had under President Ma, Larry Barrett, knows very well because he and I traveled to Taipei in 2009 or 10 and had meetings with the Prime Minister's office and legislators and other officials. There was much more trade, there was much more engagement, and China responded more warmly to the conservatives, even as it intends to do to Taiwan what it has done to Hong Kong. But right now, I think in Taiwan, it's a little, I mean, it may not have been their outcome. They probably would have liked the KMT's candidate winning better, but Lee is handcuffed in the legislature. The third party that ran, there's a corruption scandal that's brewing, so they're Taiwan's distracted. They're not going to do anything. And China is softening a little bit right now towards the United States. We're in a better tone of a really bad place in our bilateral relations, but I think Xi is not likely to pull a surprise, either in the seas or with the US, until we see who wins. Satisfied?
Thank you.
Okay.
I don't know.
Hey.
Could you explain what kind of defense agreement the United States has with Taiwan, and how does that fit into two systems, one nation?
Great.
In 5 words.
Gonna work. Everything changes, Jack? Buddhist, everything changes. So, as you all know, in 1979, the United States shifted its relationship to have diplomatic relations with Beijing and to drop the formal official diplomatic status with the Republic of China, known as Taiwan. Taiwan does not have formal country status as a result. It's a territory, it's a state. We have the Taiwan Relations Act, which for decades has governed our relations. We supply Taiwan with lots and lots of weapons. And we treat them as a de facto diplomatic partner. For all intents and purposes, they are an ally. They have huge support in Congress, and there is a certain amount of intelligence sharing, and we have Joe Biden 4 times has stated that we will come to Taiwan's immediate aid if it is attacked militarily. That's unusual and controversial. The first time he said it, the State Department kind of walked it back. But that is I can't give you numbers. I can only say that we keep it vague so as not to antagonize China too much. There's something also called the 1992 Consensus, which was never written down. It's how Taiwan and China view the one China policy. And essentially, each side believes the other will prevail peacefully. That the other will absorb. Taiwan's not going to digest the mainland, but if one day democracy rules and something happens in a regime change way, and China loses its legitimacy, which it has century by century, that's less likely than the power that Xi has assembled to have his way, which some U.S. military top analysts and policy officials believe there could be an attempt to take Taiwan within 6 or 7 years. I personally think, well, Xi Jinping is in his early 70s, and he wants, this is the missing piece of his legacy, so he may be tempted, you never know. I kind of think that if we conduct ourselves properly, it won't happen.
Yeah, since I've got the
Somebody has the mic, but the mic should go down here and back there.
Sort of implicit in your comments have been really the challenges for U.S. policy in the region. And distance, I'm a military guy, so all I see is a ton of water and how hard it is to get there if we ever had to go there. But if you could talk some about opportunities for the U.S. Encountering a rising China or others, and in particular what I've always been fascinated with is how our relations with Vietnam have changed since the early 70s. So if you could talk about opportunities we have for balancing China, and particularly Vietnam's potential role in that.
Okay, here our allies are very important, and Japan especially has, although Japan has historic issues with, or I should say Taiwan has issues with Japan, but Japan has been very active in its diplomacy with the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, and as part of the Quad with India and Australia. So their influence, in fact, Abe in 2006 was essentially the original architect of the idea of an Indo-Pacific arrangement that became the Quad. South Korea, under Yoon, he's argued for to be a global pivot power, or pivot global power. He has aspirations in foreign policy because he's sort of been a lame duck prime minister throughout, and he just lost his party got spanked a little bit more badly in the recent legislative elections, and so the good news, it wasn't a supermajority that where the conservative opposition has veto, but foreign policy is his bag, and he believes that Korea can play an economic, military, if needed, role, and 87% of the Korean public support the alliance with the United States. They're one of our strongest partners, and very good also because of their soft power, K-pop and everything else. So they're active. Vietnam's interesting because it's had hundreds of years of conflicts with China. There was just a summit, a year ago, and their policy is sort of unaligned. They have the so-called 3 no's, no military alliances, no taking one side over another, and no military bases on our land. And they contest against some of the other Southeast Asian partners, who gets what in the seas. So they're not quite there yet, I don't think, and they're newer to ASEAN and some of the other multilateral forums. But I think it'll be interesting to see. What the next president does with Vietnam, because I think it's a maturing relationship, and they are, even though one-party rule, they're a crucial new supply chain location for us as the United States de-risks from China. So I think there's that element too, that other countries too are taking. Oh, he's got the mic.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the blue shirt, and some ladies, please.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. China is dumping a lot of steel around the world, excessive steel that they have. Their car market is starting to retract big time. The real estate market is not doing good, and that would be an understatement. How do we deal with Chinese recession?
That's great.
What happens with China when they enter their first recession after 30 years of
Yeah,
progress? I mean, economic growth, that's the only thing they know. So what happens?
very, very good question. And also, she completely muffed the COVID economy by zero, total lockdown. And so China has suffered. And this, I think, also is why the softer tone with the US in the last several months. Janet Yellen was recently in Beijing and pressed, I don't know what the verb to use, this overcapacity issue, which is not just steel. But the overhang is such that growth in China is official statistics are really hazy, untrustworthy, but under 6%, maybe under 5%, maybe a recession would be continued negative growth. So they're strapped. It means, practically speaking, there's less to go around for initiatives like the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative. It means that India's profile can be much greater. India's growing faster. Their population, I think half their population is under 30. They surpassed China as the most populous country with 1.4 billion people. So they need a young population to grow. But China, because of its demographic situation, is going to have a hard time with potentially the real estate and financial issues leak into a pension kind of crisis as well. I think when Xi turned against his robust tech entrepreneurs, he went too far, and that he realizes they need to be a driver in this. So I think you're going to see some kind of unpublicized reversal there. I think Jack Ma is even floating around talking now again, but not too publicly. But on this is an opportunity for the United States, whoever is in, and I think in the bipartisan consensus, there might be a little bloodthirstiness, let's say, and way above my pay grade, but I think our investment should be in the partners and not. I don't think we need to. I think we can be forceful with tariffs and hit them over the head if they're dumping in this country, and we absolutely need to protect our tech IP. But I don't think we need to. I don't think we need to get ugly. We can probably try to draw them into, see if they'll come back and participate in talks with North Korea. China is going to get a little nervous about Russia, which has really gotten close with North Korea. China has been a little more ambivalent on Ukraine. So let's see. It's not a good thing for him.
And then really quick, before we take our next question, I just want to announce it is last call for the bar. So if anybody wants another drink, please go ahead. No.
This.
Yes. So.
Oh, here, and it'll eventually get to you.
Again. So as we've seen China continue to grow its power overseas with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, we've seen them use either influence, investment, or coercion in smaller countries such as Sri Lanka, Vanuatu, or Fiji.
Yes.
Do you think that the U.S. is doing enough to counter China's soft power in these smaller nations? And do you see any policy changes or recommend any policies in the future to combat this?
It's another opportunity for the United States, for sure, in concert with countries like Japan, which has an excellent record of development assistance and much better standards than China will apply without the coercive techniques as well. The United States under Biden has created this Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is a sad little sister to what the TPP, now the TPP is, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade-Pacific Partnership. We lost an edge there, but we do have great tech to provide and infrastructure in smaller countries, for sure. I think those Pacific Islands nations especially will want both. Will want to diversify. It's safe for them to do so. But if China leans into bullying or exorbitant, interest rates, a lot of countries are stuck with projects they can't pay back, and it's been a very mixed bag. I think the Belt and Road for China. But we should compete there, and we should leverage our partners to compete with us.
Actually, my question is right down the path of the Belt and Road. And both in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, I personally witnessed a lot of resentment about both the debt and the fact that they had all Chinese workers. They transferred no expertise as part of it. But Africa in spades, and I hate to say it, but Africa's governments have not been reliable partners. Let's put it that way. For anybody. And for in particular for the people of Africa. And what my question is how is China going to deal with the inevitable turnover that will occur in the dictatorships in Africa, where they believe in democracy once. Once you get elected, we're elected. And so all of a sudden, all these promises go away. That was the other guys.
Right. Okay, to segue, I'm going to say something that I should have said to the other gentleman, which also is an opportunity, which also applies here. And that is what, in all the economic talks that I've paid attention to, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, the countries we've been talking about in Asia have all wanted market access to this market, to the US. And we've been very stingy. And part of that is if they get it, they may be displacing a US manufacturer or something like that. But for supply chain reasons and for their prosperity, for getting their buy-in on all kinds of political and military and social things that we want, I think the next administration really needs to listen there and do that. Now, with respect to Central Asia, the same is true. Uzbekistan's ambassador was phenomenal, and they, in particular, can be a good partner to the United States. I really can't talk about that region with authority, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Next time. The Africa, and for that matter, Latin America, where the Belt and Road has traveled that far. Well, let's say this. Trump showed Africa and Latin America especially really no good attention. And things that Obama had done, to especially within our the hemispheric partners, like approach Cuba and regionally, there was promise. And I think Trump's way is to like whatever somebody else has done, he's got to do it different. He's got to have his thing. I suspect he will be that way again to Africa and Latin America as well. We're talking about mass deportation, so that's another issue. I think Harris has an opportunity to challenge. It's never easy. Africa's in 50-something countries, and but I think she may have the interest, and certainly more interest than Trump would. We'll just have to see. But China, I mean, its biggest victory, if you will, is the logistics base in Djibouti. And I think it will look for more of that. I can't really get into, its individual political relations. During the Cold War, we botched so much. So did the Soviets. We didn't care. There was proxy stuff. And truly, I think the president that has showed the most love to Africa was Barack Obama, and he looked to do, well, George W. Bush with PEPFAR, definitely, and also on AIDS, and Barack Obama in terms of entrepreneurial programs and trying to engage several countries at summits. We need to get that. We need to do that. We need to compete. We need to compete everywhere.
Building on what you had mentioned about Janet Yellen in Beijing and her soft power, food diplomacy, and then K-pop, can you talk a little bit about the role of soft power as a complement to the hard power military economics, especially with the young populations in so many countries of the Indo-Pacific region?
Yes.
She has a very soft voice.
So the question is, can you talk about the utility of soft power
Soft power.
in the region?
And especially with the, sorry, just hold it, yes.
There
Feel like I'm yelling into the
No.
echo
We
chamber.
need to hear you.
The role of soft power, particularly with the young populations, and wanting to get people on a person-to-person basis and connect there so that they will be more versed in the cultures of the Indo-Pacific region before they're dealing with decisions about military, economic, hard diplomacy issues.
Darn, I was here yesterday in Washington. Joe Nye was giving a great talk on that very subject to the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs. I would have come back with the best answer for you. Yes, when I think of soft power, I think of there is an element of Hollywood, music across all genres, our great symphonies. The United States will be celebrating America's 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And while our oldest partners are in the Atlantic, I think this is a great opportunity to activate the diplomats, consul generals in the United States, diplomats in Washington, and to showcase our superstars, our super chefs, our athletes. And Michelle Kwan, I think, is ambassador to Belize, for example. The International Visitor Leadership Program of the United States is one of the greatest soft power tools by what this council does in welcoming visitors and spreading them to the local resources. But I think the 250th is a real opportunity to commemorate, celebrate, look at shared difficulties that we've had in a new light, and win new friends. So I will say that. It's interesting, speaking of Hollywood, that there's a certain spinelessness with China and not getting into documentary topics that would, for example, expose things that are going on in Xinjiang or Tibet and so forth. So anyway, but China's soft power is weak, and we have the tools, we have the experience. Jack.
This needs to be the last question.
Jack gets the last word. Are you going to give me an Emily Dickinson poem, please?
I'm struggling to deal with the real world is now. And since you raised the Declaration of Independence issue, imagine somehow that the founding fathers had some inkling that the U.S. would become a world power, whatever that was, rivaling England in perception. How do you suppose they might have offered guidance in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution about our behavior? And what I recall, Washington's farewell address was avoid entangling foreign alliances, which strikes me in hindsight as a pretty big deal. But I'm interested in your comment. Imagine back then they could have foreseen the circumstances we're in now. Do you think any insight at all whether they might offer some comments on?
Well, I think Washington would not have been in a position to deliver that address had it not been for our ally friends. Right. Let's put that on the table. Secondly, the founding father, if he's considered one, maybe he's he's the son, he's a descendant. John Quincy Adams famously said, and I don't have the exact quote, but it's, "Go not abroad in search of monsters." Monsters. Or in search of something, or you will create monsters. Okay? Be careful with what you do, because you may create monsters. We have a tendency to look for foes. And this, I think, is what makes the China relationship so difficult and sensitive. Because my partner here, Jasmine Zhu, is from Sichuan. She's lovely. China's people are wonderful. We have a beef with their system, with their party. And government to government, we have to be fierce with them because they want to overturn what we've built. And we have, you're all familiar with the Thucydides trap and Graham Allison's arguments. But we need to be very careful not to make them an enemy. I think the language is confront, cooperate, compete, but let's not try to destroy. And it's such a fine line to walk, isn't it? We have some thinkers on the horizon potentially who are saying that the extended nuclear deterrent should just focus on China, which leaves South Korea and Japan in the cold. This person that I mentioned, who we featured at our national conference, Elbridge Colby, recently told his South Korean counterparts that they may want to think about developing their own nuclear weapons, which would mean so would Tokyo, who knows what North Korea will do. I just think that's kind of mad. Not mutually assured destruction. It's just madness to that strikes me where we get too extreme. We need to confront, we need to contest, we need to compete. And, well, when they have trouble, let's help them out when it serves us. That's it.
Stairs there. Really hoping that we didn't already give you one of these, but you probably did.
I have a collection.
I suspect we're not the only council, but this is our little globe, so I hope
Love
that you will
globes.
use it, especially in your new home that you are moving into.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, one quick announcement. Please do not forget to join us October 22nd for our next speaker series program with General H.R. McMaster, entitled At War with Ourselves, a Conversation with H.R. McMaster. That is on the website right now. I know that several of you have signed up, but there is still lots of room. And as a postscript, Larry, do you want to mention your next program coming up October 16th? The Colleagues is getting started again, and I know everyone will be excited about that. So you're welcome to do that.
The college program will be in October, and it's going to feature a professor from UCCS who's a specialist in Africa, who's worked in the State Department, has been assigned as a diplomat in Africa, so look for, go to our website here in the days ahead, and be able to register for that outreach program.
Yeah, for those of you that aren't aware, the Colleagues is a members-only program of distinguished local speakers that promises to be a good one. So thank you. Good night. We'll see you October 22nd.